trying to cover some of the things that we just spent the last 4 hours talking about. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And we're at that time of year where Shawn, started today just kind of chatting it up before the recording, and legitimately 4 hours have gone by. We've talked about a lot of different stuff. There's a lot of different research that we're both doing. There's a lot of different teams to cover. We talked about a ton of like evergreen concepts, a bunch of things just about how to evaluate fantasy and how to play, and the 2024 results, and just so many things that would have made great podcast episodes. I know our listeners love when I start by telling them about all the stuff that we didn't hit record for. We get the feedback. They're like, why don't you just hit record when you guys are talking? We should. We're kind of just warming up. When these days happen, and to explain the title at the start of the show, we typically try to then rope back the best of the stuff that we went over into the show. But yeah, we both just now we're like, well, what are we going to call the show today? It's like, well, we're just going to basically call it the Untitled Show and try to talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. But it's been fun chatting with you for the last 4 hours. Our listeners are now being brought in for hour 5.
It has been a lot of fun. I always enjoy the talks. I learned so much. And I mean, if we were paying someone thousands of dollars to edit the show, then that would make some sense. We are obviously paying Colin Kelly, our fantastic producer, probably not enough to have sifted through that conversation.
Not even close.
Put together a good podcast. But Ben, you are in the midst of doing your projections. You're going to have your show starting up with Leone, where you guys break those down. Probably the most important projections-related content that exists in the fantasy sphere. I know everyone's looking very much forward to that. I just put up the Big Gorilla Bible. I was going to call it just the update, but I put a bunch of additional things in the piece. Broke down a draft I did. Ben, there's a link to our main event show in there. Discussed a little bit what we did in the main events. Put in the full ADP list and all of the player targets there. Obviously updated a few things. Wrote about Nico Collins at length. He's someone that Connor had brought up to me as being a player who just, it makes the whole end of the first, beginning of the second interesting, difficult. I was a little skeptical at first. I went back through a lot of the stuff on Collins, and I'm like, I should definitely be drafting more Collins. I do think we have a 16-player first round, which, Ben, you and I got the 110 and the 111 in our 2 early main events. So we got to benefit from that. We got 2 players from that group in each draft. The other part leaves me thinking that when you make that selection in every draft, there's this element of thinking, maybe I won, but I may have just cost myself $1 million by missing on the guy who not just is like a good value at that price, but someone who legitimately is going to be the most impactful player in all of fantasy, right? In that sort of 12 to 16-ish range. We obviously could have the top scorer from this year coming out of that section. Not just guys like Collins, who has these insane per route results over the last several years, but someone like an Amon-Ra St. Brown, who was the overall wide receiver 2 last season, despite dealing with everything that he deals with in Detroit with all of the teammate competition. You have Brian Thomas, who frankly could be the next guy to take that step to having like the CeeDee Lamb 2023 type of season. You probably aren't going to be in a position where you say, oh, this player is definitively better than like a Jamar Chase or a Justin Jefferson. I don't think we necessarily believe that's true about a CeeDee Lamb, but having a 400-point season from a Brian Thomas, I don't think that is certainly impossible. You think about a Christian McCaffrey, who, as the repository reports about his health and usage, he continues to rise. We know that he probably has the highest per game ceiling in all of fantasy. And then you and I both believe that Devon Achane has a chance to be the overall RB1. And that was something else that you were talking to me about as you went through some of his profile.
Yeah, that's one of the teams, as you mentioned, I've just been starting the projections process. And every year as I do it, for me, it's less about the actual results, the final projections, the final lines from the players, and way more about the actual research, which gives me a good context on, the range of outcomes and what I think from a probabilistic perspective is available for the different players. It's so funny. You finished that little note with H. And we talked about so many players as you were going through. I was just like, oh yeah, we had some really good stuff in the last few hours about those guys. You finished on H. And I definitely wanted to joke about how you, on one of our recent shows, you got me on him by talking about how high you were on him. And we took him in one of our mains already. And we're talking about taking him in both. Maybe we took him in both. I can't recall exactly, but it was a little bit like, oh yeah, you really think he's that high? Because you were saying, he should maybe be going in the middle of the first round. And then I mentioned to you, as I go through my projections process, one of the things that I do as I prepare to write about every team is I go back to my targets per out run series that I wrote right at the end of the season, at the end of January. And in that, I talk about the running backs as well. I call them the targets per out run posts because that's how they started several years ago. But really, it's just like a postseason stealing signals, almost like a recap of every offense. I think I keep calling them this specific thing because it keeps my it keeps me from getting too in depth and too many different topics, and it keeps me a little bit more focused. But I went and read what I had written about Achane, and it's just sort of hilarious because it was like the argument very, very similar to the argument that you had made to me, and I was like, oh, I guess I thought that too, but I had kind of forgotten the case. But I mean, like among the stats that I had pulled back in January, in 2 of his 11 games, Achane averaged a ridiculous 6.1 catches per game. In the 6 that he missed, he averaged only 1.8. So 6.1, 1.8, hit a massive 89.7% catch rate, which is like feels completely unsustainable, but it reinforces how much of his role were these really high percentage run game extension, quick hits, and something that Tua is very good at. He gets the ball out quickly and accurately in a way that the defense can't like blow across the line of scrimmage and stop Achane from catching. And that's why the catch rate was so high. I mean, there's other players that get the quick hits, but Tua might be the very best quarterback in the league at getting those out on target as quickly as possible. Maybe not the very best, but definitely in that upper echelon. And so Achane has a season where he catches 78 passes, 10 more than any other running back, which is a meaningful gap over every other player. And yet he had splits, like I just said, where in 11 games, he averaged 6.1 per game. And in the other 6, he averaged 1.8. Because as soon as Tua was out of the lineup, they no longer called those plays. McDaniel went a different direction. Their run rate spiked. Instead of using the quick passing game as an extension of the run game, they just called run plays because they didn't have Tua in there. And so as I had written about it back in January, I noted that this means that there's, a clear implication going forward that the massive receiving season, not necessarily something we can specifically bank on, because if Tua misses more time, that's scary. And then I wrote, and yet, what if Tua plays all 17 games in 2025? Can Achane catch 100 balls? And as you've talked about, what I wrote, this is a young player who built on 2023 in ways we needed to see, more volume and getting there despite less efficiency after displaying his playmaking all throughout his rookie year. What you've talked about is, what if he puts those two things together, the efficiency and the playmaking in 2023 with the usage stuff that was so promising in 2024? That's kind of what I had mentioned here as well, that he goes into year 3 of his young career having clearly established himself as a centerpiece of Miami's transitioning offense. It's a very exciting profile when you think about the fact that he could have a 100-catch season. And then if he adds explosive plays that he had in 2023 but didn't have as much in 2024, again, we're looking for outlier, huge ceiling, dominant players. He can easily be the player that defines 2025. And that's what you were saying is, I think was so well put, is picking at the end of the first round is super exciting, but you only get to take 2 of those players. You mentioned the 16 first-round profiles. Of all the guys you just mentioned, I guess I'm getting to the point where, because I'm getting so excited about the other profiles, I'm maybe getting a little less excited about Brian Thomas from the perspective that it's we've talked about this. It's entirely possible that long-term Travis Hunter is the better player. He was probably the better prospect coming out. He was drafted incredibly high. A new regime is there, and they traded a ton to move up to go get him. And in rookie camp and mini camp, I saw something where he had I can't remember who the tweet was from, but he has had 7 practices. He's been a wide receiver almost in like primary or entirely in 5 of those, a cornerback primarily in 1, and then split in 1. So the vast majority of the practice usage has backed up what we've heard from the team from the beginning, which is they see him as a wide receiver first, and that's where they think he's going to contribute earliest. That doesn't mean that Brian Thomas is still not a very exciting player to be all in on as a year 2 guy who had an incredible first season, but that's a fascinating part of his profile as one of those 16 guys, and I still think he's clearly a part of that. But the other one you mentioned was Nico, who we talked about. And I mean, man, going through...
And you said that you were souring on Brian Thomas, I just did want to throw in some bad news that he was the 2nd-round pick for us in the other main event.
Yeah, we did take him already. So we have... I mean, we still really like the profile, and we... I mean, I'm fine with having him. I still think he clearly belongs in that
range. I just said 400-point season, and you're going to come back with I'm souring on him.
And I'm like, this is the guy I don't want to draft in this range. But you mentioned the Nico stuff. That's another team whose projection I've already done. And I mean, digging back into his notes and again, the stuff that I wrote in the Targets Per Out Run series from January, which, by the way, subscribe, bengretch.substack.com. You can read about all the teams and the research that I did. It's all forward-looking research from early in the offseason. It's. I mean, I talk about this all the time, but I love to write these pieces in a way that is specifically because I know I'll want to come back to it throughout the offseason and remember where I was at right at the end of the season with a lot of the little contextual pieces of how the season went that are a little bit harder to remember to the next June. So it's always a fun one for me to get my own thoughts that I may have forgotten a little bit over the last 6 months since I wrote this piece. But the stuff I wrote about Nico, incredibly optimistic as well. His yards per out run were incredible again in year 4 after the massive year 3, which was the huge step forward. His yards per target kind of had to come down because that was... And when I mention yards per target, I always, with yards per out run, it's split into targets per out run and yards per target, or those 2 things make up yards per out. And I always love to kind of think about how these things piece together. But his yards per target was a big reason why his yards per route was over 3 in year 3, which was massive. It was this crazy breakout. It was an 11.9 yards per target in 2023. That's just like sort of impossible to do again. And yet he was still over 10 again this past year, even though it came down, regressed a little. That's still very, very strong to have a yards per target up over 10. And he added a bunch on the targets per route side. And so his yards per route was still very, very strong. He took another huge step forward in terms of earning volume per route, despite another season where all the ancillary players get injured in this offense and they really have to rely on Nico to win as a legit like outside X receiver against defenses that don't want to let that type of player win. He's one of the few out there that is just consistently right now dominating. And in a season where CJ Stroud had a hard time and they had a hard time protecting him and they made some changes to the offensive line. It's a little up in the air to see what will actually happen there, because they also traded away Laramie Tunsil. They did some different things. New offensive coordinator was one of the ways that they thought they could address some of the line issues and some of the ways to give Stroud more of a chance to throw and those types of things. But Nico now does have Christian Kirk coming in. He's got 2 young rookies in Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, which, I mean, those guys are all going to probably just help Stroud and help the offense and help Nico. But, last year, Tank Dell gets hurt again. He's gotten hurt both of the last 2 years. Diggs gets hurt, and Nico is kind of left standing with not much else help around him. And he's still putting up this type of per route production. That's the point, I guess, that I think is so interesting, is that it's difficult to be that efficient per route when teams are going to be able to key on you a little bit more in those things. But when he's out there running these routes, he's still winning at such an incredible rate. You made a great point to me that he also doesn't run routes like 95% of the time. He's more like in like the low 80s sometimes, which is a little different than some of the other alphas around the league, like a Jamar Chase or a Malik Neighbors, who run basically, they're out there basically every single route. And that can sort of artificially change the way that you want to, or the way that his per route production looks and the way that you want to interpret it, because probably a lot of the gap between 82% routes and 95% routes is empty routes that they're kind of taking off Nico's plate, but some of the other teams are giving to their star player because they don't want to ever take their star player off the field. Regardless, Nico's numbers objectively, I mean, he's a superstar. I look at depth adjusted racer, which is a stat that converts air yards into receiving yardage, or how efficient a player was at that, is the racer element. And then you depth adjust it for the ADOT to get an idea of, basically just coming up with an expected racer for that particular ADOT and then adjusting it. He's massively in the positive in that regard relative to how deep his targets are. Both of the last 2 seasons. And again, all the stuff that he was able to do last year in a down year for the QB and the offense. I mean, this guy's just really, really good. Focal point of the offense. When I went through my projections, I had to cut his TD rate way down because it was like jacking up the overall production for like CJ Stroud and everything, because Nico's missed some time the last couple of years as well. But his touchdown rates have been so good the last 2 years that if you get 17 games of Nico Collins anywhere close to that TD rate, he's just elevating CJ Stroud's past TD rate to a degree that's very positive in the whole projection, which is just to say that Nico's really good at converting touchdowns also. Even as I cut it down, I still have him above average at that. And this guy's going to have another really great season because he looks like an absolute star.
I think that's true. I moved him from 16 to 13 after working through all the different pieces. I do still have those 4 guys in more or less a dead heat. A couple of things I do think are interesting. Blair has some good work if you want to go through the RotoViz study hall, but kind of the best of the best pieces, looking at how yards per route run is sort of so foundational to how people view fantasy football at this point that it does tend to be overpriced when we're looking at the ADPs of different players. You mentioned a lot of great stats that I think are extremely relevant. One that SIS has that's, maybe mostly interesting, but they have a bunch of charting work that allows them to take sort of the EPA numbers and translate them into points earned, where they're kind of breaking that out within the given plays and looking at who's responsible in the plays. And so then they can take this sort of points above average number that they get and look at it on things like a per route basis. Probably not a surprise to anybody that Collins was number 1 in that in 2023. He was 6th in 2024. It's interesting because the guys who come right after him, Amon-Ra was 7th, Brian Thomas was 9th. They're definitely kind of in that same mix. When you are looking at the different routes that people might run in terms of total routes, I think those guys probably have an edge, although so much of it's going to come down to an individual team. And that's one of the things that's interesting here as we're thinking through different probabilities, is that it's likely that we have a group of guys who are somewhat concentrated in the same type of area in terms of what their most likely outcome is. And then we're going to see what health does to the different individuals, and then we're going to see what the team context ends up being. One of the things that obviously happened for the Cincinnati Bengals last year is that you get these guys in terms of a Joe Burrow, a Jamar Chase, playing successfully, healthily together, which hasn't always been the case. You have some of these seasons that are interrupted by injury, and suddenly guys who are just unbelievable stars, they look a little bit more human than they probably are because they're not healthy and playing together. Then you add in a situation like the Cincinnati defense struggling, and you have these shootouts that then ramp up both the total volume, and when you're as efficient as those guys are and you're scoring a bunch of points as a result, you have the possibility for these massive, massive seasons. And so it'll be interesting to see, what are the Jaguars like? What are the Lions like now with a new offensive coordinator. What are the Texans like? Ben, you and I joked before the show that these rookies who have been drafted onto, the various teams in the first round and then at the very beginning of the second round, looking at guys like a Jaden Higgins and a Luther Burden, that except for Burden, which, his coaches talked very glowingly about him. It always kind of cracks me up. You run into random weird things on YouTube. A lot of listeners who are more plugged into some of this stuff than I am, and will just have seen it when it happens. There was an entertaining little just snippet where the kind of beat writers there in Chicago were asking Ben Johnson about Luther Burden, and his immediate response was just stud. Have you seen the highlights? It's kind of the same response that a lot of us who have been, watching the highlights, we'd be like, have you seen the highlights? It was like, I watched this guy's highlights. I think he's very good. But like actually on the field there in minicamp and whatnot, Jaden Higgins has just been, he's looked like a burgeoning star, right? So when we're looking at these per route efficiency numbers, there's a similar dynamic to what you're looking at with target share, where, so much of the efficiency is just the ability to draw targets. You get the really high numbers, really specifically in seasons where you have guys like a Nico Collins, like a Tyreek Hill, where they're drawing a lot of targets per route. And then they're also very efficient on top of that. And then they're a little bit route limited in terms of not running every route that the team has. Then you have these extraordinary results. Can you get enough routes to have the massive ceiling season? And are you going to still be able to do it when you have teammates? One of the things that we have seen with Tyreek Hill is like Jaden Waddle is okay, and he'll also put up good yards per route numbers playing off of me, but he's not me. He's not going to step on anything that I do. Will we find that from some of these guys that we haven't necessarily found in the past? One of the things that we've seen is that Nico and Tank can work effectively off each other, although they've been injured in such a way that you don't have nearly as much of that as the Texans certainly would have liked to see. Now that you have this new wave of players, and I'm probably more skeptical of Christian Kirk. I'm probably more enthusiastic about Jalen Noel, but one of the things that has come out of the early notes is just that Jalen Noel does seem buried. Higgins seems like he's going to be like the guy. And then you work through some of the other things. You and I had both discussed Amon-Ra and how he was dealing with this type of environment and even a much more extreme environment already in 2024 and succeeded. The thing that's important, I think, to realize there, and certainly drafters apparently realize it completely, is just that fending it off once doesn't mean that you'll fend it off again. In some ways, his ADP is surprisingly cheap for someone who has accomplished what he has accomplished the last 2 years. And yet again, part of that is just that there are 16 guys who probably are like very clear first round profiles. And as I kind of throw it back to you here for whatever thoughts that has generated, I want to note that Brian Thomas, the person you claim to be low on, I was doing a little work with the Game Splits app as you were talking there, and with Mac Jones as the main guy in games that Trevor Lawrence didn't play, Brian Thomas averaged 19.3 points per game. 19.3 points per game with Mac Jones. Again, I'm just going to stick with 400. It's 400 points.
Yeah, no, that's obviously very good. And I say low in the perspective that you had just laid out the dilemma in at the 1-2 turn, which is whichever guy you take, you wonder if the other guy is the number one overall player. And I guess from that perspective, I started thinking about Travis Hunter, and I started wondering if I feel that confident about Brian Thomas. I still think he belongs in that group, as I said repeatedly. So I don't want it to be like I don't think he's good.
Everyone listening, Ben is all out.
I was at this time last year. I finally got around on Brian Thomas in like August, and it was a regret of mine to have not been high enough on Brian Thomas last year. So again, I go back to my targets per out run piece from last year. And then one of the big things I recapped the year for Jacksonville is like, I'm not going to be low on Brian Thomas next year. He was way too good. But the one thing that a lot of what you were saying actually kind of generated for me was you're talking about the routes thing. And I think you mentioned this in our conversation before the show and also during the show. And for the guys that aren't running the full routes, like the Tyreek Hill, this is really the 2023 example. The per route numbers are massive, and the per route numbers for Nico were massive last year, even though he was only at about like an 80-something% rate. It seems like you're sort of thinking about like maybe not dinging them, but sort of like their numbers are inflated. I guess I wouldn't put it that way. They were still that good per route. I guess I would only utilize that point. So like a very semantical point I'm making, but only utilize that point as a favorable note on the guys who are out there every single play. Like a Jamar Chase, who ran the most routes in the NFL last year. I think it's very fair to be like, well, his per route numbers are probably a little bit lower from the fact that he had to play every single snap all year. But I guess I don't see the issue for like a Nico, because I still consider 82% or so routes to be like a full-time receiver. When I look at it from like a stealing signals perspective and those things, there's not that many players who are at 95% plus. It is usually the very top players in the entire NFL. But being anywhere above 80%, you're running enough routes in any individual game. And then the production per route, I guess I don't think it's inflated. I guess it's deflated for the guys that have to be out there for every single snap. Does that make sense?
It does. Let me throw it at you a little different way, a way that I kind of couched it before I decided that it was probably misleading to look at Collins as a little bit lower of a target share guy, in part because you have the 3 different games where you're leaving early. Now, even the one where you leave early, you have an element that is kind of inflating. Now, again, it's small potatoes in the overall scheme of things. But when you go out in week 18 and you run 8 routes and you draw 5 targets because the team is trying to get you to 1,000 yards, then again, I mean, you're going to have some interesting things going on. I think because Nico Collins was not a big-time prospect, didn't do a lot his first 2 years, and then the last 2 years have not even, I mean, certainly not red flags. They have just these minor notes, and you have injuries, and you have questions about the Texans team context. So thinking through why it would be appropriate to have him, outside the first round at all, much less, part of this group that could extend to 16, right? But when you look at his target share over the last couple of years, where he has been extraordinary on a per route basis, the target share comes back to only being okay, which again, as we've kind of discussed, there are reasons that is the case. And once you kind of work through that, it's actually not a problem. But as I was trying to work through where you would need to get and what types of seasons generate 20 points per game or more. Now, you can be very good without hitting 20. If we got like 18 points per game from Nico Collins, where he's being drafted, you'd be like, awesome. We did everything we needed to do here to put together a fantastic team. But when we're talking about drafting to get to massive teams or massive scores from a player who could then help you build a super team, there were only 3 seasons out of like the 64 that I came across in the screener where the individual player didn't have a really high target share. Now, again, this doesn't even necessarily apply to Nico for the reasons we've discussed, but those 3 seasons were 2011 for Calvin Johnson and then 2018 and 2020 for Tyreek Hill. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, Megatron and Tyreek Hill, these are guys who, yeah, it doesn't surprise us that they would break the rules. But it's not just that they are so good, but that, I mean, a lot of people, as I say that, are probably already thinking to themselves, well, are those possibly the 2 seasons where Patrick Mahomes threw for 5,050 and Matthew Stafford threw for 5,040? Because if they are in a 16-game season, right? Because if they are, then you're like, yeah, your target share of that kind of season doesn't have to be as high. The 2020 season for Hill was another good season for Mahomes, not quite to the level of that 2018 season. And that's kind of where it comes back to for me with Collins, where like if Jaden Higgins is as good as I think that he's going to be, or just that he could be, right, then we do actually need to have the Texans look a lot better offensively than they did last year. And one of the things I originally had in the notes before I kind of shifted how I couched the whole thing was just that I actually was very optimistic that CJ Stroud, not like a 5,050 season. I mean, you're probably not going to get that, but I thought that a 4,535 season was very possible with what they had put together, with how good Stroud looked as a rookie. You've now got Collins and Dell and Diggs all together. Yeah, you have injuries, which ruins it. But even if they hadn't had those injuries, I mean, you could tell right from the beginning that that kind of season was not going to materialize. In the end, it completely crashed and burned. It just kind of emphasizes again, and then kind of going back to these other discussions that we've had throughout the last several seasons about how difficult it is for, you know, any team to kind of get those elite passing numbers at this point. That, I mean, you need to get out there and just generate a lot of total targets. Can Collins stay healthy enough to do it? Will the team have that? And like, if their defense is good, right? If they go out there and stop committing all of these cheap shots that get important people suspended for a bunch of games, if they are able to move the ball effectively and score, are we going to get a Titans that, well, they're not going to be the Titans. Are we going to get a Texans team that has enough volume? Or are we going to get a little bit more like, one of the things that's been problematic for the Chiefs the last several years, beyond just being bad, is that their defense is now good. And you don't have the incentive to create the same type of season, even if you want, if you don't, I mean, if you're winning your games anyway. And you do get the sense that like Andy Reid is pretty disgruntled that the Chiefs are winning that way. I think the Texans would actually be very excited if they could win that way. And maybe that's not fair.
Well, it's fascinating because in that scenario, then Nico's routes probably wouldn't be very massive. But so you were kind of tiptoeing around the targets per route versus like market share stuff, or not necessarily tiptoeing around, but I obviously love to use the targets per route stuff and the yards per route stuff, and also get a little bit fired up about it from time to time. So you're probably like, oh, not trying to get that going here, but I don't know. I can count. If I had a nickel for every time I've been told that target share is more predictive than targets per route, I'd be the wealthiest man in the world.
People are just going out of their way that much to hammer on target share. One of the reasons I like to mention target share is that I almost feel like it's something that people just like have completely stopped looking at.
They forget. Yes. No. And it doesn't surprise me at all that Blair's research found that yards per route is overvalued. There are a lot of people that use the per route stuff incorrectly. And there's a lot of people that as a result are constantly attacking that stuff. And then because I use it as, I like to refer to targets per route run as a foundational stat. There's all the contextual stuff that's been shown in the aggregate, like how many wide receivers are in a formation, how that influences targets per route and yards per route, how many, routes or the route percentage and these things, and how they're going to influence the difference between targets per route and market share and all these things that are going to influence targets per route. If you just take every player's targets per route, another huge one, would be ADOT. You got the players that have the really low ADOTs and just get a bunch of cheap gimme targets or what have you, versus, layering in the fact that earning downfield targets certainly matters. If you just take like targets per route and put it in a line and then try to compare all those players as if those are all apples to apples targets per routes, you're going to be incorrect. You have to understand the context of each player's role and their route, like their route distribution and how they're used and the offense that they're in and all of those types of things. I think is very, very important. Having said that, the reason that I think it's such an important foundational stat is it tells us something very specific once we understand those things. And for a player like Nico Collins, he's a high ADOT player. He's very efficient after the target. You've mentioned, and we've both addressed now that he doesn't run the full like 95% of routes. They got a new offensive coordinator this year, Shawn. Two of the biggest hits I've ever had by using the per route stuff specifically were being early on Cooper Kupp's 2021 breakout because he wasn't running 100% of the routes, and being early.
This was actually
on
something that came up in my mind constantly when you and I were talking before the show and like didn't get into. And it was just something again where I'm like, because we were kind of talking about how there's this narrative out there that Kupp actually had a pretty tight window of time when he was utterly dominant. And I'm just like, Sean McVay is this utter genius. I mean, one of the reasons that Cooper Kupp is so sad to leave is that you can tell that he holds McVay in incredibly high esteem. One of the reasons I've been so frustrated by, a coordinator who may or may not have coached for the Seahawks and the Bears, but there are a variety of reasons when you go back. Why is Cooper Kupp not on the field all the time? Like there's a fatal flaw in how that worked out, and certainly I do think that what I assume you're about to say, your route participation can go up.
It can go up. That remained true for Kupp going in, or it was true for Kupp going into 2021. It remained true for CeeDee Lamb through his third year. That was really a breakout year. And when I wrote this targets per route run piece after 2022, what I emphasized was that even though each of his the years of his career, he had set career highs in targets per route and routes. In year 2, he was more than year 1. And in year 3, he was more than year 2. The phrase that I used going into 2023, which was his massive breakout year, or maybe it was going into 2022, I can't recall, but I wrote that there was still meat left on the bone from the different components and that he was a displayed efficient player. And so that you get the yards per target efficiency. That's something that's a lot of people like to regress that as well and say that's not very sticky. Well, I mean, good players are good. I mean, we're all choosing what we want to bet on. I wrote a piece last year called "You Have to Place Your Bets." I mean, we on this show, we like to bet on players that are efficient and good at football and not try to regress all the efficiency out of playing fantasy football and just try to project volume, because that's not the way that you find outliers or win. There was still meat on CeeDee Lamb's profile, both from a routes volume perspective and a targets per route perspective. Those things went up even higher in 2023 when he had his massive breakout, when he was a 1-2 turn guy and then was like the overall wide receiver 1 or whatever. And going into last year was a top 5 overall pick. That's the sort of asymmetrical bet that I see with Collins. That is the point that I was trying to emphasize, is even if the circumstances conspire to limit his overall routes because the offense plays a certain way, or limit his overall production because Jaden Higgins is also a very good football player, what I see in the per route stuff for Nico Collins and what needs to be emphasized about it is that he is a superstar, right? What he does is earn a ton of volume, 26+% targets per route over both of the last 2 years. And that went up to 28.3 last year. And maybe there's little things that boosted that, but that's at a high ADOT, which gave him, I have the weighted targets per route run element that tries to control for the ADOT part of it. It gave him the second best weighted targets per route run in the entire NFL last year, behind only Puka Nacua, whose route sample was also smaller. And both of those guys do need to be contextualized, but the point is it's elite for the routes that he did run. And then the yards per target being so good both of the past 2 years, all of those things could conspire to hold Nico down, and he would be a small miss at cost, is basically the worst possible outcome. The things that could go well, the fact that I'm saying that I think there's actually meat on the bone in some respects, could make him even more dominant than he's been to this point, essentially, is the case that I think needs to be made. Like when you talk about like the market share versus the per route stuff, maybe he does run 95% of the routes this year because the new coordinator decides, as you were saying, Shane Waldron wasn't making those decisions with the Rams necessarily, but Cooper Kupp went from, for whatever reason, always being the guy that would come off in 2 wide receiver sets through 2020 to in 2021 being the guy that Sean McVay kept on the field. And he was even better on the outside than he was in the slot, so he didn't need to come off. And then we saw that in 2021. He had the greatest wide receiver season of all time when you consider the fact that he went through 4 playoff games and played 21 games and maintained his level of production and won Super Bowl MVP. It was insane. A lot of his gains in 2021, I mean, he got even better per route while adding routes. It was crazy. And CeeDee Lamb did the same in his breakout year. Maybe Nico doesn't have the room to do that. Maybe Nico doesn't have the room to get even better per route while adding routes, because he's already so high in terms of the yards per route run and the yards per target and those elements. But I do think that's the way that I try to contextualize the profile and use the per route run stuff is not to miss the parts of the market share and those things that are relevant. I don't know. I just think the per route run stuff is probably a little bit overvalued, but I also think it gets a lot from once you get into a certain degree of analysis with really sharp people, it gets a lot of negative pushback. And I guess I think most of that is just from not using it correctly or not thinking about it or applying it correctly in terms of the bets that we have to make. And Collins, when I look at the profile, I'm like, this is all the things you're saying are very valid concerns. He's still going to be really good because he's like what this profile says to me is he's clearly very, very good at football and very good with the quarterback that he has in hand because they had a tough year last year. You're kind of talking about how the offense could be maybe not as exciting overall, and then Higgins could take from him. I guess I just don't think that can happen. If Higgins is good, the offense does get better. It has to. Stroud has to have a better year. It's just additive because Nico Collins is going to be good on his routes.
He had a little bit of a slow finish, which always factors in my mind because I did have him as a key part of some important teams last year. So that let down. I mean, you always have to be aware of what your emotions are telling you and how they could be hijacking you. And one of the things is just, we talk about how efficient he was. I mean, Benny had the 75-yard touchdown that was wiped out on a completely meaningless penalty. You don't go back through and add in all the things that kind of happened. I mean, you don't necessarily go back through and add in all the touchdowns that Xavier Worthy almost had. This is one it was just very clear cut he had, and there was a meaningless procedural penalty that wiped it out. I mean, you're talking. I'm saying that the efficiency is already so crazy that it really is one where you probably do want to knock it down some. It's not realistic to stay at that level, and yet the reality is that there's a 70-yard touchdown not included in there. So,
and then postseason, which I don't think are in these numbers for me, 2 8-target games where he caught 12 total balls for 203 yards and a TD. So he averaged 6 catches, 100 yards and a half a score.
He was very good in the playoffs. He was all right. The guy that worries me, but worried me last year and finished as the wide receiver 2 is Amon-Ra, because I mean, just how do you feed all those guys?
Yeah, we were talking about him before the show, and I was trying to explain to you why I like Amon-Ra at his price, and I was like, you know what, Shawn? It's just because his price has never made any sense to me. Because, well, it's not never made any sense, but the price movement over the last 2 years has been weird. Because going into 2023, I was really in on him at the 1-2 turn. And that's the year when him and Lamb were going at the 1-2 turn. I was really in on Amon-Ra because, again, another sort of per route thing, and was taking a lot of him, and he ended up having a really great season. And then going into 2024, last year, listeners will remember, he was going in the middle of the first round, and I often use this line that was well, going into 2023, he had Jameson Williams suspended for half the year going into that year. The rookie tight end that was a good profile, but we didn't know a lot about. And they had Gibbs and they had David Montgomery. Going into 2024, he had the great season, but suddenly the rookie tight end had a breakout year. Now you have that guy going into his second season. And also Jameson Williams did enough late in 2023 and into the playoffs, especially, that we were talking about him as a 2024 breakout. And he was not going to be suspended for half the year. And he had the vibes were really bad on him going into 2023. They had really turned around going into 2024, where we were optimistic. And so it seemed like those two things should be flipped. Going into the 1 year where contextually there's really nothing to worry about. Then going into the next year where, okay, you have multiple potentially really good other players. And there is an element eventually of you can't have 30% targets per route when there's really good players all throughout the offense, obviously. So why did Amon-Ra?
Well, one of the reasons he's being knocked, so you've got to kind of work through this, is that Jameson Williams' yards per route run were fantastic last year.
They were fantastic. But why was he? Yeah, so I guess that's why. Because people didn't want to buy into Jameson Williams before he had shown it in 2024. But it didn't make a lot of sense that people didn't want to buy in 2023 when he'd already shown the profile, including the per route run profile, the production profile, whatever, all the elements were there for what he'd already shown. And then he has a good 2023, but in a way that also means that he's probably got more competition in 2024. And that's when people bought in to a mid first round price tag. I was willing to pay mid first round prices in 2023. I was not in 2024. And then he has a good year in 2024, despite all the included competition. He has a great year, really, when you consider that. He's still at the very top of his game in a season.
It was extraordinary,
where,
and he probably wasn't like that close to 100% for chunks of it. I mean, this is somebody who played injured, whereas, I mean, if you're just played hurt, right? If you're just injured, I mean, you can't go play through a lot of injuries, but Amon-Ra did it at what was, and it's similar to the situation with Malik Neighbors, where these are guys who are playing at well less than 100%.
Yeah, and so he took a step back. I'm looking at my targets per out run piece, whatever. Again, it's not only about targets per out run. That's just how I use it foundationally. But his role was similar enough that we can compare his different seasons, apples to apples, understanding the competition changed a little bit. His targets per out fell from 28.8 and 27.4 the previous 2 years to 25%, 25.0 in 2024. So they fell down a little bit. His yards per target was still strong. His yards per route run fell as a result of the targets per route run falling to 2.29. Still very good, down from back-to-back seasons over 2.4, which are great. But I wrote that's all very minor, especially because his ADOT rose a bit to a new career high. But what I also wrote at the end of this paragraph was I'd suggest that sticking at 25% in an offense where a very strong year two tight end like Laporta started lower in targets per route and fell further is actually a positive note for Amon-Ra, because Laporta did lose a lot more per route volume from year one to year two because things got tougher when Jameson Williams was playing the whole season instead of being suspended for half the year, and was very good, as you noted, had a very good season. The running backs also, obviously, I mean, especially Jahmyr Gibbs has an incredible season. So Amon-Ra, despite all the added competition, has this great year at this mid-first price, but now he's going early second, even later than I mean, I guess it just like, if you were drafting him in the middle of the first round last year, I don't understand why you're not willing to take him there again after he stuck at a 25% targets per route and had a 2.29 yards per route run in that crowded of an offense. That's like, to me, again, similar to the Nico thing, Jameson Williams being great was additive. Amon-Ra continued to produce, even though he was playing hurt to a degree, like you said. Having said all of that, I didn't love his price in the middle of the first last year. And it's funny, you say that you're a little concerned about him in the early second. I guess I am too, because it's just the price movement is the only thing that is just, I don't understand the price movement. I don't understand what the market's doing, but I don't know that I
want to
love
ask you a couple of questions about it. And also sort of a question as it relates to another player who is much more expensive. To me, it doesn't seem like, when you think it through all the context, I guess I would have trouble with Justin Jefferson not being considered the best wide receiver in the NFL, even though I think Jamar Chase is probably close. And I think there are even guys like A.J. Brown who, in an offense that was more favorable for actual receiving production, would maybe also be in the mix. But
I thought he had a piano
like,
on his back.
I tell you what, he's so big that he looks like one of these throwback players. You go and watch the old school highlights and you're like, what's wrong with the guys? And they're like, they're wearing not like, in terms of the pads and that type of thing, it's so different because they look like robots compared to the current players because of the way that the pads present.
Right.
AJ Brown still looks like that. So Justin Jefferson, I would make the argument that he's the best wide receiver in the NFL. And it's one of the reasons that he's so expensive, because you're going to be very resilient to context when you're simply the best player. But it is the case that they both played 17 games last year, he and Amon-Ra scored a half point more in regular PPR leagues. And you could argue that they're both going into similar situations again, that Jefferson's might be a little bit trickier in that at this point, Jordan Addison, it seems like both in the fantasy community, but also in the reality community, people have gotten comfortable with the fact that he's actually one of the best receivers in the NFL. He's not Justin Jefferson. He's a step down from that, but that in terms of how they run the offense, what the threat is, it's a real threat. You now have TJ Hawkinson, another year removed from the injury. He probably becomes first of all, he's going to play the whole season. And then secondly, he's going to play better. So you have more of a threat. And as opposed to having either an elite quarterback or continuity where maybe you build with a bad quarterback, because you could argue I don't think it would be a correct argument, but certainly someone could make a little bit of a case that that's kind of what the Lions have done with Jared Goff, is build with a mediocre quarterback. You get great additional, peripheral pieces, you get good coaching, and you're off to the races. The Vikings have to start over with a rookie. Now, your rookie probably has a lot more talent than a Sam Darnold, but I mean, there are going to be tricky elements there. Do you think there's any reason to be especially skeptical of ADP that's punishing the one guy and not the other? And or do you think are you concerned about the coordinator change in Detroit?
No, I think those are good questions because it harkens back to my whole Nico Collins rant, and I tried to kind of tie that into the Amon-Ra question, but then you get it to the Justin Jefferson question as well. And I mean, to your point, if Jaden Higgins goes all the way back to the Nico thing, if Jaden Higgins is really good, I guess for me, it almost is as simple as if there's one other really good receiver in the passing game, but the other, because there's 5 eligible players in a play. And typically one of them is either blocking or is an outlet player. So it's like 4 downfield routes max. Sometimes it's 2, right? Sometimes the running back's running a swing and the tight end's running a curl or something like that. Talking about like 3 downfield routes, maybe 4. And so it really might be as simple as, do you have one other good target, earner and efficient player in your passing game, or do you have 2? Do you suddenly have 3 weapons? Because once you have 2, it does become a little bit of a different game. And that's kind of what I was relaying as it relates to Amon-Ra. But then the interesting thing about Amon-Ra, he was down to 25% targets per route. Laporta fell even further. I mentioned he's at 17%. Jameson Williams is at 18% in his breakout year because he's more of a vertical threat. It's going to be a little bit of a lower rate of targets per route, but the air yards per route, for example, or the air yards per target, the ADOT, they're going to be very high.
And then after the catch,
it's going to be great.
You don't want Jameson Williams to have a one-on-one with anybody. He's going to go for a touchdown.
Yeah. And so Amon-Ra works off of that in a way that he's then able to really be a target hog, because Jameson Williams isn't necessarily going to be a target hog. So the different profiles matter in slightly different ways. Hawkinson is one of those underneath guys that will earn a lot of targets. I've said a couple times this offseason, I don't know if on Bananas or elsewhere, but I do think the Vikings have the 3 best, like the best big 3 in the NFL. And I don't think it can be really argued separate. Like, I don't know how it could be close, because Hawkinson's a legit tight end. And Addison, as you just said, people are getting comfortable with him as probably like a top, I think you've been calling him since last year, like a top 20 wide receiver in the NFL. The guy's like only going into his age 23 season. He was an age 21 rookie, scored 10 touchdowns. Age 22, he scores 9 more, and he won the Biletnikoff at 19. I mean, this guy's just been amazing at all points. He's 23 years old, and he's amazing. And then you have Justin Jefferson is the guy that I hadn't said yet, but you just said is the best receiver in the NFL. So if he's part of your trio, you're already at an advantage when you're going. I mean, what's a better trio? I mean, Amon-Ra and Jameson and Laporta, but like, you're probably taking the Vikings every day of the week, in part because Jefferson is that much better than Amon-Ra.
Right.
Yeah, because Jefferson is that much better than Amon-Ra. So it's fascinating to think through where it becomes an issue. And I think it sort of starts to become a little bit of an issue when you have 2 other really good players, and particularly if they can be target dominant players. And then it becomes a little bit, about the offense. For the Lions, it became clear that Laporta was the one that got less focus from the scheme and all of that stuff. The fact that he's still a really good talent, it should be a concern, because a new coordinator could potentially want to utilize him more, and that could directly cut into Amon-Ra and sort of the areas and the depths of the field where they operate. But otherwise, it's really just Jameson, and Amon-Ra's pretty much free reign to do the things he's going to do, and he's got a great connection with Jared Goff. He doesn't have a quarterback change, etc. And when you ask about the Jefferson thing, the quarterback change seems pretty relevant. The fact that Hawkinson operates in a lot of the lower ADOT areas, so that you have target competition in the areas where some of these guys really earn a ton of volume. I mean, like Jamar Chase, for example, his ADOT is weirdly lower than it should be in most years of his career, because they throw to him on really quick hitting routes a ton. He's their Amon-Ra and also their Jefferson in their offense. He's also their intermediate to deep weapon. But he's, T. Higgins is running the Jameson Williams stuff down the field, and Chase is running the Amon-Ra routes to the extent that, they exist in the Cincinnati offense, which gives him this volume profile that's incredible. Jefferson, I agree with you, is probably the best receiver in the NFL, but it doesn't probably definitively run enough routes in those areas to have a lock on a 30% target per route, for example, especially if Addison grows, because Addison might be viewed as a Jameson Williams, just kind of a field stretcher, has had a high ADOT. But if Addison grows in a way where he's able to start doing more at lower ADOTs, which it definitely seems like it's possible given his profile, I guess it does feel a little crowded for the Vikings, and I don't get super excited about Jefferson at cost. To your point, why is Jefferson not being dinged, and why is Amon-Ra a second-round pick? Jefferson is that talented, and I do think what I was saying with Collins, this idea that it's an asymmetrical bet and that at worst he's a small loss, I think at worst Jefferson would be a small loss, but his cost is that much more that it's really hard for him to be a big win. And Collins, we were talking about if he has one major competition piece in a Higgins breakout. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic on Kirk than you, but I don't think Christian Kirk, even in a ceiling season, is a guy that would dramatically affect Collins, is basically the way that I would put that. And Dalton Schultz is definitely not that guy. So like a Higgins breakout in my mind is not enough of a threat among the 5 eligible receivers in, a given route, because there's that trade-off between a threat to earning the target versus the defense having to respect the other legitimate weapon on the field. I do wonder if Addison plus Hawkinson, the fourth name or fifth name, no one else would matter at that point. I guess I still think I haven't done the Vikings projection yet. I still think Jefferson's going to probably earn a significant amount of volume, because even though he's never really gotten a lot of the underneath routes, he still earns a ton of volume down the field. He's just a sublime route runner, right? Like you build your pass game around him, even when you have 2 other really good players. It's just the way that I've always done projections and looked at it is the number one player gets his, and then you figure it out from there. And that's kind of how the Lions played out last year. Amon-Ra was the alpha, and then Laporta's the one who got hurt. Probably Jefferson is a negative for Addison or Hawk more than Addison or Hawk is a negative for Jefferson, is the way that I would look at it. But it's a different game at his cost. And you're talking about an extreme, he's going like right around Jahmyr Gibbs, right? Like you're talking about a different decision point. He's going ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs on a lot of sites. You're talking about a different decision point with Jefferson than with Nico Collins or Amon-Ra. So I don't know. I think it's a good question. I'm just kind of talking through it, but I don't have a strong answer. Probably wind up underweight Jefferson at that cost, to be honest.
And one of the things that both the work yesterday and the discussions with you today has kind of brought home to me even more is that we talk about these like 16 first round players. And we're specifically talking about FFPC with the tight end premium element. But you can look at it in a variety of ways. Christian McCaffrey now in many formats is going very early. And so any discussion of him like in the 13 to 16 range, people are like, he's going in the mid first. What are you talking about? Partly, again, this emphasizes that it's not just like the 13 to 16 range that is tough, but that really as soon as Jamar Chase is off the board, that, it's the Wild West for like 15 picks. Those guys all have very good arguments. Certainly Bijan is an interesting one where in full point per reception leagues, he tends to be the number 2. I worry about his explosiveness at that price. Certainly I don't worry about him. He's absolutely awesome. Think about Saquon, who is the number 2 overall player in, half PPR types of formats. Even in half PPR, you worry about the high value touch element of his profile. We talked about Jefferson, who is more or less in that 3 to 4 range, 3, 4, 5, regardless. Obviously, people know both the upside and the concerns with Jahmyr Gibbs. Gibbs went 101 in one of my Big Gorilla drafts.
He's the
which
102, right? He has to. I just decided that. The Jahmyr Gibbs is the 102.
So when I had Ben, I did a couple of these drafts, and I had the 102 in both of them, which was kind of fun and also a little bit annoying because you're just like, every draft, you're like, I want to draft one from the front, one from the middle, one from the end, and just keep rotating it so I get different teams and I don't get locked into like intentionally diversifying when you don't know if you're actually going to have the picks later to like make that something that matters at all. In the one draft, Gibbs went 1, and I was the happiest person in the world to draft Ja'Marr Chase number 2. In the draft that, not surprisingly, Chase went 1, I did take Jahmyr Gibbs at 102.
You did?
Now, I have Brock Bowers ranked number 1. I am anticipating, I mean, I don't know what's going to end up, but I don't know like how much Big Gorilla, how much Main Event. I don't know how much you and I are going to be able to do together. But I'm thinking that this year, after having so much fun with it last year, having good success that gives you some money in your account to, be able to explore some of these things, I'm thinking somewhere between like 15 and 30 managed teams. And I'm hoping that some of those leagues are in that like 4 to 8 range where I'm just like, it's Brock Bowers every time. Brock Bowers. So when I had the 102, I'm like, I'm going to take Jahmyr Gibbs, who...
What's his ADP?
I mean, there's so many ways in which 104, I believe.
Okay.
There are so many ways in which Jahmyr Gibbs is like, I mean, he's a lion, right? So even though the style is not exactly the same, you're like, it's Barry Sanders, right? And then, I mean, we've all watched him now, and you're like, it's Jamal Charles. It doesn't really matter how many other players are on that team and how many other ways there are to split up the pie. When you're thinking like this is a mix between Barry Sanders and Jamal Charles and he's available and you're on the clock, you're just like, I'm going to pick Jahmyr Gibbs. And if I lose, I lose.
And if you want to talk about a guy, who's got that element of like, there's still meat on the bone. I mean, you go look at his splits when David Montgomery actually misses time, and his scoring is like 28 points per game. It's through the roof. It's absolutely insane. It's still really, really good when David Montgomery's on the field. Last year, the Lions addressed this by basically using Montgomery on the first drive of every game when he was healthy. And yet, so they didn't treat Gibbs as a quote-unquote starter. And yet, the year prior it was Montgomery's going to wear the defense down and then we're going to, turn to Gibbs or whatever. And it was more like a 50-50. Last year, they would use Montgomery for the whole first drive and often just like drive all the way down and score a touchdown because of the Detroit Lions, and they could just do that. And yet Gibbs would still wind up on the plus side of like a 60-40, which meant that kind of after the first like 10 or 12 play drive, Gibbs was actually playing more like 70% of all the snaps the rest of the way. It's like they were just doing this token drive to start. And they're like, yeah, Gibbs is our nominal, like he's our actual like guy that we use. And again, when Montgomery was out, they were like, we're going to really, really use him. And Gibbs, anytime those opportunities presented themselves, was incredible. In week 18 to win the division, he had a 4-touchdown game in the one playoff game where they lost to the Commanders. Massive fantasy production. Those were his 2 highest scoring games. Fantasy managers don't really remember because they weren't part of the fantasy season. But week 18, everyone was trying in that game against the Vikings. And the playoff game, everyone was trying. And he looked unstoppable in those 2 games. He's probably the best running back in the league. I've been thinking about McCaffrey, who I didn't realize his price was rising. But Gibbs, I'm looking at the Underdog ADP. McCaffrey's now at 8, which he was, to your point, I mean, in FFPC, he's still not even in the first round necessarily. Gibbs is 6 over here. And that's where I was looking, and I was like, he's got to be 2. But Barkley's going 2. But I've been thinking of McCaffrey as sort of the arbitrage Barkley from the perspective that McCaffrey basically just had that season in 2023. Barkley had it in 2024. I don't know how much to weigh Barkley getting almost 500 touches last year. I do think if he's on the field for the whole season, he's going to be very, very good and probably worth this cost. But that seems to be the only thing that's holding McCaffrey's price down. Now McCaffrey's price is rising, as you said. And so people are coming to that conclusion as well. It's like, as long as he plays, he's going to score at an RB1 overall kind of level. But there's legitimate injury risk. I think there is a legitimate injury risk with Barkley too. The only difference is Barkley was healthy last year and McCaffrey was not. And so Barkley had his season last year. McCaffrey had his in 2023. But they both have a very similar, I think, elevated at their age and, for McCaffrey, recent injury, for Barkley, recent massive workload all the way through a Super Bowl. I do think it's a real thing to have 500 touches and be asked to come back the next year. And just the playoff run is really what kind of tipped me on Barkley being a little bit concerned about that health stuff. Those are very similar profiles. I don't have that concern with Gibbs. Again, I think it works in your favor that he's been splitting with David Montgomery the last couple of years. There's room for this to be the year where he actually, again, meat on the bone, actually has significant improvement in role. And my point about them using Montgomery in year 2 as just a token first drive guy, but then really turning to Gibbs, was that we almost started to see this shift already where Montgomery was viewed more as a backup. Montgomery's now another year older and had another injury last season. And Gibbs is now another year closer to his prime. I mean, or whatever. You could say he was already in his prime. We say that with running backs all the time, but you established, I guess, right? And again, what he did in 18 and what he did in the playoffs, that's their last memory of Jahmyr Gibbs going into the offseason. Yeah, they have a new coordinator, but I think the new coordinator is just going to be like, yeah, we just have to play Jahmyr Gibbs. David Montgomery's the backup now. I mean, I don't, or at least that's possible. It feels like the perfect small miss, big hit thing where he's going to be worth a first round pick, even if he's splitting with Montgomery, because he just showed that he could do that last year. But if he gets the potential for all that more work, and I mean, yeah, he's a smaller back. Maybe he's an injury risk too. Everyone gets hurt. I mean, like what can we do about all that? I'm just saying, from an age perspective, and he's not coming off a 500 touch season. I don't have the type of concerns with that. I do, I guess, in my mind, elevate the concern for Barkley and McCaffrey. For Gibbs, it's just like, this is a young dude who's had his touches mostly held back, but it could be any season where that actually explodes forward for him. It's like Jamal Charles early in his career. He was splitting with Thomas Jones, and then eventually he just became the dude, and he had the season that, Shawn Siegele won the 250K.
So I do have Bowers and Chase in their own tier, but I have moved in the update that I referenced. I have moved Jahmyr Gibbs to number 3, which is just the fun way to do it, right? I also want to note that, again, we talk about how tight this whole tier is. I mean, you mentioned Barkley, you mentioned Robinson, you mentioned McCaffrey. I still have Barkley and Robinson above Ashton Genty because they've showed it, right? And the floor is clearly better. And when you're talking about a floor being better because there's less uncertainty and they have the ceilings they both have, you probably have to draft them there. We talk about these difficult decisions. You and I had the chance to draft Genty at 11 in one of our main events, and we took Malik Neighbors instead. I kind of think that there are just, you run this season thousands, millions of times. A huge chunk of those seasons, Ashton Genty is going to score more points than Saquon Barkley and Bijan Robinson. If he were going at 3, I'd be like, okay, well, that seems a bit rich. But like, if you get the 103 every once in a while, take him. So you get.
We should have taken him over Neighbors, you're saying.
I'm a little bit nervous about Neighbors. It's tough, right? This is such a fun group. It's such a fun season. You don't want to go into a year where, like, every time you have a draft, you're so nervous about pulling up your draft slot. You're like, gosh, I got the 9, I got the 11, I got the 12. I'm so far behind the players who drafted the top. Now, the reality has been that hasn't really been the case, even in those years where it seemed like it was going to be the case. We think about some of these seasons that have come from the 1-2 turn recently. But I just think as drafters, it's so much fun to have a season where, I mean, again, it's so deep.
It's super
the first
fun.
round and a half.
We took Neighbors over Genty in the same draft where we took Brian Thomas over Nico and Amon-Ra, if that's...
Nico went at the turn, so it was over Amon-Ra.
Just over Amon-Ra. So the rest of that team's going to wind up being perfect, and we're going to look back at the 1-2 turn and be like, "What were we got the 1-2 turn wrong?" Great. So it'll be like that year a couple years ago where we auto drafted Bijan in his rookie year over CeeDee Lamb, and that team probably would have won BBM if it had CeeDee Lamb.
It was absolutely perfect with every other selection.
Yeah.
For anybody who doesn't remember that story, it was because I was on the wrong tab, clicking on StreamYard, trying to make the pick. Then
he shared the screen for our YouTube watchers and was trying to click on the recording window where the Underdog screen was being shared, and the clock ran out because he didn't click over to the Underdog window.
It was about as embarrassing as it ggets. So, but Ben, this has been so much fun going through with you a few of the notes from our earlier conversation. I love 2025. I think this is going to be a fantastic season. That'll be this episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you are over there at Stealing Signals. You can get so much of the content that Ben talked about today and more at bengretch.substack.com. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz, coupon code RVRadio2025 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year subscription. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.